Hey everyone, and welcome back to Horror Movies for Life YouTube channel. I'm your host Brian, and this is your bonus horror anthology movie review video as part of this July 2025 series. I planned on doing 8, but you're actually going to get a ninth one, a bonus one. And you can see my shirt there. For many of you that know and have been following my channel, you know that my favorite show of all time is the original Twilight Zone series that ran from 1959 to 1964. Um, with that being said, I happen to have a long history with the movie that I have here on DVD, The Twilight Zone, the movie from 1983, not The Twilight Zone, Twilight Zone, the movie. So I'm doing this as a bonus review for a couple of reasons. One, it was time that I revisited this movie, and two, I think this might have actually been the first video that I ever put on my YouTube channel, formerly known as Brian's Horror Corner, way back in the beginning of 2021. That video has since been taken down and deleted, so you can't find it on there. So I was due to review this on my channel. The reason I took it down is very simple. It was if it wasn't the first video on my channel, it was one of the first three. And I didn't have a lot of subscribers, I didn't have a lot of views, and it really wasn't that good of a review. So I figured it was time to give this movie a more proper review here. And what better time to do it than in the middle of a horror anthology review series? So yes, Twilight Zone, the movie from 1983, is the bonus anthology review video that I'm dropping here this weekend. So let's just go ahead and get into it. The Twilight Zone, the movie, is a 1983 American science fiction fantasy horror anthology film produced by Steven Spielberg and John Landis. It's based on Rod Serling's 1959 to 1964 television series of the same name. The film features 4 stories directed by Landis, Spielberg, Joe Dante, and George Miller. Landis's segment is an original story created for the film, while the segments by Spielberg, Dante, and Miller are remakes of episodes from the original series. The film's cast includes Dan Aykroyd, Albert Brooks, Scatman Carruthers, John Lithgow, Vic Morrow, and Kathleen Quinlan. Original series cast members Burgess Meredith, Patricia Barry, Peter Bracco, Murray Matheson, Kevin McCarthy, Bill Mumy, and William Shallett also appear in the film, Shallert, with Meredith assuming Sterling's role as narrator. So yeah, the Twilight Zone movie from 1983. This is actually one of the first movies that I remember watching as a kid. I didn't see it at the theater, but either my parents must have rented it or something, but I remember watching it, or maybe it was on TV like in the mid to late 80s. I don't really remember. Um, but so I have a pretty long history with this movie. Um, and in my previous review, I don't want to say I shat on it, but given how good the original series is, I was kind of disappointed in this movie. Upon my most recent rewatch, which was the other night for this review, I can recognize there's a lot of good things about this movie. It was one of my more enjoyable watches, you might say. Um, of course, I've seen this movie probably 25, 30 times in my life, but I don't know. Upon this last rewatch, I was a little bit more forgiving on it. Maybe it's because I'm watching a lot of anthology movies, and they range from pretty bad and low budget to all time greats like Creep Show and Trick or Treat. Um, I would say this movie's definitely it's on the lower side of the high end, but on the high end of the lower end, if that makes sense. So let's just go ahead and get into Twilight Zone, the movie, starting. Well, I'll just go through the stories and go through the movie basically. So it starts with a prologue that was actually written and directed by John Landis. This is about 2 men who are in a car driving along a country road late at night. The conversation turns to what episodes of the Twilight Zone they found scariest. I absolutely love the prologue. When I was a kid, this was the part that scared me the most out of any movie that I'd seen. Of course, I hadn't watched a lot of horror movies as a kid, but I absolutely love this part with Dan Aykroyd and Albert Brooks. It's just brilliant. I mean, starting with the fact that they're driving in a car like on this desolate road late at, or what's turning out to be night. It starts out like at dusk. Um, right there, you've already got my attention, and then you throw those 2 actors into it. I mean, it starts out, of course, with uh, the song by Clearwater Creedence Revival, Midnight Special. Just kind of everything about this segment works for me, from the music to the actors to how it turns to the Twilight Zone, and then the Twilight Zone series and talking about episodes. Before that, they whistle or give hints about famous TV intros, music, opening TV show openings, and then they get into the Twilight Zone, and then after they talk about some of the Twilight Zone episodes, then they get into the scary part of this, and that's where the phrase "you want to see something really scary" comes from, by Dan Aykroyd's character. And whenever I hear that phrase, "Do you want to see something really scary?" I always come back to this movie and this moment, this prologue in the Twilight Zone movie. And I'm not going to give it away, even though this movie's been out for over 40 years, but just in case. Um, I'm not going to tell you exactly what happens, but it scared the hell out of me as a kid. I'll leave it at that. So that was the prologue. And then we get into our first segment, as it said, narrated by Burgess Meredith, because obviously Rod Serling had passed away about 8 years before this movie was made. But segment one is entitled Time Out. And this is the one that is not a direct remake of any one specific episode from the original series. Although it is kind of a working remake of a couple episodes back there, as well as A Quality of Mercy. I would say those two episodes. This particular segment draws a lot from those two episodes. Um, so it is a partial reworking, but it involves a man who exits a club after a conversation about the feasibility. Actually, it's a very angry man, a racist man, kind of a bigot, you might say. He kind of goes off on different races and different nationalities as he loses out on a promotion at his job, and he meets these two in a bar that he's going off with, and or he's going off about all this stuff too, I should say, and then he ends up leaving angrily. But he finds himself not outside of this bar that he went into, but rather in 1940s Germany, Nazi Germany, basically, and it kind of goes from there. And this is one of those don't assume, like, comeuppance given. Now, let's just go ahead and get into the elephant in the room when it comes to this segment. Obviously, this was not the segment. It did not turn out the way that they planned because, unfortunately, during the making of this segment and this movie, Vic Morrow, the main actor here, and as well as two Vietnamese children who do not show up in the movie now because of what happened, ended up being killed in a scene having to do with where they're swimming through a lake or a swamp or something. A helicopter is way too low, and it ends up crashing into this swamp or this lake, this water area, and the blades end up beheading both Vic Morrow and one of the children, and the other child is crushed by the helicopter that crashes into this lake. Famously or infamously, I would say more infamously, John Landis was brought up on manslaughter charges, as well as some of the other producers of this particular segment. They were let off by, I think, with just fines. They were found not guilty of manslaughter. Basically, it was just chalked up to a bad accident. But man, what a tragedy, man! It should have never happened. Basically, the only thing they were brought up on was the two children shouldn't have been working this late at night, without supervision, without like a teacher or something on set. So they were breaking rules there, the California state law, basically. And I don't want to spend too much of this review on the tragedy. If you don't know, you can search for it on YouTube. There's lots of documentaries about it, including one on Shudder from a few years ago, Cursed Films. I would definitely I would recommend checking that out. But yeah, so anyway, to get back to it, this segment had the potential to be very good, and it just ended up kind of being so because of the tragedy that was involved, because they didn't get the ending. You don't get the typical Twilight Zone a lesson is taught and comeuppance given. I don't know how to describe it. Basically, I think the way this episode was supposed to work was that Vic Morrow's character was supposed to learn a lesson by basically experiencing different nationalities and races in other shoes, and what it took for those particular nationalities and races to get to where they did. where he just chalks it up to they get everything and I have to work for everything and they don't kind of thing, but what was supposed to happen was during the scene of the tragedy, he was rescuing these two Vietnamese children. So he was kind of having an arc to his character to where he was becoming, I don't want to say a good guy, but he was kind of starting to get it. And obviously they had to scrap all that because of the tragedy. So he ends up just being carried away on this train in Nazi Germany with some other Jewish people. And this train car, he sees his two friends from the bar leaving the bar and looking for him outside of the bar, and he's yelling for them. And of course, they can't see or hear him because he's in the Twilight Zone and they're not. So that's kind of this segment. Um, the second segment, directed by Steven Spielberg, is a remake of the episode Kick the Can. An old man named Mr. Bloom has just moved into Sunnyvale retirement home. He listens to the other elders reminisce about the joys they experienced in their youth. The third segment, directed by Joe Dante, is a remake of the episode It's a Good Life, one of the more well known episodes of the original series. Mild mannered school teacher Helen Foley, which was also a name from another Twilight Zone episode from season one, um, Nightmare as a Child. She's traveling to a new job and visits a rural bar for directions. While talking to the owner, she witnesses a young boy, Anthony, being harassed by a local trying to watch the boxing match. And I didn't realize it until this last time, but that local happened to be Bill Mummy, who played Anthony in the original Twilight Zone series. He was the boy in the original series of It's a Good Life. I didn't realize that until this watch. I don't know why. Obviously, he's grown up here, but that was very cool and very interesting. Helen comes to the boy's defense as Helen leaves the bar. She backs into Anthony with her car in the parking lot where he's on it, damaging his bicycle. Helen offers Anthony a ride home. Then the fourth and final segment, directed by George Miller, is a remake of the episode Nightmare at 20,000 Feet with William Shatner in the original series. While flying through a violent thunderstorm, airline passenger John Valentine is in a laboratory trying to recover from a panic attack due to fear of flying. The flight attendants coax Valentine from the laboratory back to his seat. He is repeatedly assured by the flight attendants that everything is going to be all right, but his nerves and antics disturb the surrounding passengers. And then he claims to have seen a man. I don't know why he calls it a man in this particular segment, but not a creature, but a man on the wing of the plane. It's a pretty famous, not just episode, but it's a pretty famous premise that a lot of people know. So, and then the end of segment four ties back to the prologue, which I absolutely love, with Dan Aykroyd, who's driving the ambulance as he's taking John Lithgow's character away. And asking him, I heard you had a big scare up there, huh? And John Lithgow's character says, "Oh yeah." And of course, he's all wrapped up and he's all in the white. He's in the what you call it, like the straight jacket at this point. And he says, and then Dan Aykroyd nods and says, "You want to see something really scary?" And then the Twilight Zone. I just love it. This might be my favorite ending to any horror anthology of all time, at least of the ones that I've seen. I just absolutely love that callback. I wouldn't call it a wraparound, although I guess you could. Dan Aykroyd being the wraparound, but I think it's more of a prologue at the beginning and then a callback to it at the end. That's how I choose to see it. But it works well enough for me to kind of throw it in that wraparound category, and I absolutely love it. I just love it. It might be my favorite part of this whole movie, to be honest with you. So that's how the movie plays out. Now I'll actually get into my pros and cons of this movie, as this is going to be a longer video, unfortunately, but I want to give it its due credit. Starting with the pros are the things that I liked about the Twilight Zone movie from 1983. All right, so here we go. So for the pros, I love the opening prologue, as I said, with Dan Aykroyd and Albert Brooks. It really sets the mood to the movie, and it's a reminiscent. It also reminds you of what the Twilight Zone series was. The stage and it sets the stage, and it scared me the most as a kid, as I mentioned earlier. The music throughout this movie the musical score by Jerry Goldsmith throughout the entire movie is very good, especially in the second and fourth segments. The old folks' home and the guy on the wing of the plane. The movie is star-studded with great performances throughout by Vic Morrow, rest in peace, John Lithgow, Scatman Carruthers, and Kathleen Quinlan. as well as everybody else. And I love the fact that Burgess Meredith is there to narrate taking Rod Serling's place because he was a huge part of the original Twilight Zone series. And obviously, Rod Serling, as I mentioned, had passed away about 7 or 8 years before this. But it was very fitting to use Burgess Meredith, and he does a great job narrating. I really enjoy the second half of the movie the most. Segments 3 and 4, directed by Joe Dante and George Miller, who were more of the unknowns at the time. I mean, uh, uh, John Landis and Steven Spielberg were more or less the well-known directors at this time, and their segments weren't as good, in my opinion. Now, for John Landis, it was his own fault because I think that segment could have been pretty good had he not killed his actors by being irresponsible. But anyway, um, but I love the segments 3 and 4. Both had great practical monster and makeup effects, creature effects. Both are remakes of classic Twilight Zone episodes. And to be honest with you, I actually prefer John Lithgow over Bill Shatner. I actually prefer this version of 20,000 Feet, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, than I do over the original series' episode, which I never was. I mean, it's good for the time, and I realize the time was very different than when they made this movie in 1983. But everything just works better here. John Lithgow's performance is better, and again, Bill Shatner's a great actor, and he acted a different way in the early '60s than they did in the '80s. So I take that into account. I'm not here to shat on Bill Shatner, but I do prefer this segment more than the television series segment. Mostly because of the creature design. If you remember in the TV show, it's a guy in a gorilla costume. Let's just call it what it is that you see through the window. Where here it's a 1980s practical creature effect. It's very effective. The look of the creature is very effective, very creepy. So that automatically makes this the best segment of the whole movie for my money. And I don't think John Lithgow gets enough credit for his performance. I mean, he's the best performance in this movie among many good performances, but he plays it like somebody that has a panic attack, anxiety, his emotions, just everything about it. He's so good in this segment. I can't praise his performance enough. I also love as I mentioned, I love the ending of the callback to Dan Aykroyd's character from the prologue. He's really good in this movie. I like that they had Rod Serling still close out the narration at the end of the movie. Very respectful, very satisfying as a Twilight Zone movie. Burgess Meredith could have done it, but they basically used Rod Serling's closing narration from the series, from the TV series, and that was very well done. I really liked that they did that. The first segment, which is the one that was not a full blown remake of the classic episode Time Out, though it does borrow from A Quality of Mercy and back there, as I said, it's well conceived and very Twilight Zone-y. Like if it's an original episode, it definitely has Twilight Zone kind of vibes. I mean, if you watch this episode, you would say, yes, they did a good job of making this a Twilight Zone kind of episode. That's only downfall, as I said, is the tragedy that took place in the making of it. Otherwise, I think this would be right up there with the 20,000 Nightmare at 20,000 Feet segment. As far as cons go for the Twilight Zone movie, the Spielberg segment. I'm sorry, but it's my least favorite with the kick the can. I was never a big fan of the kick the can episode in the series either. It's fine. I don't hate it or anything, and I don't hate this segment. The music's very good, and the music and Scatman Carruthers in this segment is what makes this at least watchable. It just happens to be my least favorite of the movie because it's much more of a fantastical story, a fantastical sort of story than being eerie or scary. Obviously, the real life tragedy that I talked about that befell the first segment looms over this entire movie, sadly, and doesn't give the first segment a proper ending or a satisfying narrative as a result. Some people won't even watch the movie because of what happened and the fact that they still kept that segment in there. It severed the relationship between Steven Spielberg and John Landis. Um, it led to a manslaughter trial. I mean, just everything about it is unfortunate and sad, and it does hang over this movie in a lot of ways. The third segment, It's a Good Life, while being very visually and effects driven in a fun and 80s kind of way that I really enjoy, it doesn't have the same tension or creepiness that the original series episode had. It's a Good Life, because here they kind of make Anthony less inherently bad and more just misunderstood. Because the teacher, the Helen Foley, actually basically comes to his aid at the end and say, I can be your teacher, but we've got to control your powers. I can see what you can do. Where that's not the case. The end of the episode in the original Twilight Zone series, he just continues to send people to the cornfield and continue to get away with being evil. So that was kind of a little change, which I didn't mind the change, but it's just not as effectively creepy as Twilight Zoney creepy as the original series episode was. But I still love the practical effects and the direction by Joe Dante. Finally, the last segment, there is no way John Landis, or I'm sorry, there's no way John Lithgow's character wouldn't have been tied up and cuffed right away, especially if this segment were made now after 9/11 after he first sprang up and said we're all going to die. It kind of suspends disbelief a little bit, even for 1982, 83. I think they would have. I think they would have cuffed him a lot earlier, especially when you had an off-duty cop there with handcuffs and a gun. So that's a little hard to get around. But as far as ranking the segments here, kick the can is my least favorite. That would be number 4. Time out, the first segment, would be number 3. Number 2 would be It's a Good Life. And number 1 is definitely Creature on the Wing, Man on the Wing, whatever you want to call it, or Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, as it's known in the original show. Overall, guys, I have to say, I've been too hard on this movie. It's not great. I wish that some of the first 2 segments were better. Um, I wish it was a little scarier, but all that being said, for the time it was made and for what they have here, the writing is great, the directing is great, the practical effects are better and great than the original series, and that's why I think like 20,000 Nightmare at 20,000 Feet works better here. I'm going to give this anthology movie an 8 out of 10 overall. I don't think I gave it that high in my earlier review from 4 or 5 years ago. I think I gave it more like a 7. But this is an 8 out of 10 anthology movie, the Twilight Zone, the movie from 1983. Go ahead and comment down below your guys' thoughts on the movie, what you think of it, the tragedy if you want, all that kind of stuff. Please like this video, hit the little notification bell, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. It would really help me out with my channel going forward, and I would appreciate it. So I hope you enjoyed this bonus review, anthology movie review video. I still have one more anthology to review, which you'll not be disappointed in a couple of days here. With all that being said, though, thank you for watching. I hope you're enjoying, and as always, stay scared. Bye.